Welcome back, Room 13. We are going to continue reading by The Great Horn Spoon by Sid Fleischman. It's a Gold Rush adventure. We are going to be on Chapter 6 today. Chapter 6 is called Spoiled Potatoes. And you can see from our picture we have someone climbing up sort of the mast of a ship. Again, not quite an image that helps me with the title, right? But we know the title is usually like a big event or a main idea, spoiled potatoes, so maybe that'll be a big part of our story. And we know the image is usually something that does happen in the story. So this image of someone climbing up, if I look really closely, it looks like a young boy, kind of looks like he has lighter hair, so maybe it's Jack. It's just a prediction I have. But let's go ahead and jump in. Day after day, the two gold ships beat their way north along the ragged coast of Chile. Black smoke boiled up from their funnels, and headwinds spun it out into long streamers. Jack sat on a keg, and Praiseworthy stood over him with a pair of scissors. The boy's hair had shot up like broom straw during the long passage through the street, and Praiseworthy had no intention of letting it grow any longer. "Hold still." "I am holding still," said Jack, "still as I can." Praiseworthy snipped away. "You'll be a young man before your Aunt Arabella sees you again. May she forgive me. You're getting your height like a sapling." "Praiseworthy," said Jack, "do you really think we'll strike it rich?" "No doubt about it." The wind carried away snips of yellow hair. "Maybe all the gold nuggets will be dug up before we get there." "Nonsense, there'll be enough for all." But in the privacy of his thoughts, Praiseworthy didn't believe for a moment that they would be stubbing their toes on lumps of gold. Still, he must see to it that young Master Jack did indeed strike it rich. It would not do to return to Boston without a sack or two of treasure. Why, some of the passengers had brought along chests and boxes to be filled with nuggets and gold dust. As Praiseworthy clipped away, passengers stood around watching and offering advice. Even a haircut broke the monotony of these endless days at sea. "Needs a little more of a snip on the port side," said Dr. Buckbee, who had thrown away his alarm trumpet and regained his good humor. "Nah," said Mountain Jim. "Work them shears along the starboard beam there, Praiseworthy. That's where it wants evening up a mite." A shout from the lookout drew everyone's attention to the Sea Raven astern. "She's stopped making smoke, Captain." Smoke had indeed stopped billowing from her funnel. Captain Swain came out on deck and gave the ship a squint. "Her coal bunkers are empty," he said. "She went around the Horn. We saved fuel slipping through the strait, but we're not in much better shape ourselves, gentlemen. If this wind doesn't turn around, we'll be burning our last lump of coal soon enough." By the end of the day, the Sea Raven slipped entirely from view behind the horizon. Praiseworthy took no comfort from the Lady Wilma's lead. "It's the end of the race that counts," he said again. It says he said it again, right? But I definitely remember he told the captain when he first met him that the end of the race that counts. And it's one of those things where, again, I've not noticed the author is repeating something. And so I wonder if this is a clue. I wonder if this is foreshadowing. Foreshadowing is when authors give us glimpses into something that'll be important or that might happen in the future. So I wonder if this is foreshadowing. I wonder if the end of the race is going to be really close, which is something I hope for because that would be kind of fun to read about, right? So I'll read on. The wind didn't turn around. It died away completely. The Lady Wilma was able to keep steam up in her boiler for almost a week. One day grew warmer than the next, and soon the gold seekers were peeling off coats and sweaters. Jack shucked off his shoes and took to climbing the ratlines. The tarred hemp ladders stretched up to the mast tops. Wearing a stocking cap the first mate had given him, he would spend hours in the crow's nest, seeing the world. There were times when he felt he could see almost to California. So that was the picture for this chapter that we saw. We were right, it was Jack. The day came when the last shovelful of coal was scraped out of the bins. The boiler fire burned out. The merry thrash and throb of the side wheels ceased, and the Lady Wilma sat becalmed. Becalmed. I know I've read that word in this before. I think when they were talking about the square rigger. And if I use what I know about the word, it's Becalmed, becalmed. It has the word calm in the middle, right? And I know calm is like relaxed or slow, right? So maybe to be becalmed is to be like slow, or I guess in this ship for this scenario for a ship, maybe it means it's stopped because they've run out of coal and they said there's no wind. So I'm thinking maybe becalmed means that they are stopped. There's no wind to push them and they have no coal to power their boat. Day after day, the gold ship languished on the sea, waiting for a good wind to fill her canvas. A week passed, 2, and then fresh water in the tanks got dangerously low, and Captain Swain ordered it rationed for drinking only. Oh no, it's hot and they can only use water to drink. I mean, that's smart, but it's probably gonna get smelly. Ugh. From the crow's nest, Jack looked down on the gold seekers, wandering the decks like caged men. One day, Praiseworthy came up the ratlines, bowler hat, umbrella and all, and they watched for whales to pass the time. Is Aunt Arabella an old maid? Jack said solemnly. An old maid, replied Praiseworthy. He leaned his chin on the hook of his umbrella. Your Aunt Arabella is a young and beautiful woman. Is it because of my sisters and me? Is what because of your dear sisters and you? I mean, if she didn't have us to bring up, maybe she would have got married a long time ago. The butler dismissed the thought. Stuff and nonsense. Sarah said once it was because of us. Dear Miss Sarah is mistaken. I have no doubt that your Aunt Arabella is merely waiting for the right gentleman to come along, and I dare say he'll be delighted to gain 2 fine nieces and a stalwart young nephew. Constance said Aunt Arabella was in love once, but he died, and she never got over it. Dear Miss Constance is mistaken, I'm sure, Praiseworthy replied softly. No, let's have no more of this talk. Look there, aren't those sharks? Sharks they were, and Mountain Jim, who was fishing, caught one. He called for the cook, and Mr. Azariah Jones gasped. You're not going to eat that thing, are you? I sure am, answered Mountain Jim. If he had the chance, he'd eat me, wouldn't he? Another week passed, and Mr. Azariah Jones' 18 barrels of potatoes began to spoil in the hold. I'm ruined, he wailed, pacing the hot decks. His heavy face hung slack under a large straw hat. Nonsense, said Praiseworthy, out for a stroll. I'm a poor man, groaned the Yankee trader. I had every cent I own in those potatoes. I tell you, I'm ruined. Then you must sell them, remarked the butler, who wished only to be of service. Sell potatoes? My good friend, it's clear that you know nothing about trade. Not a thing. Who do you think will buy them? I haven't the faintest idea, said Praiseworthy, but that's only because I haven't given the matter any thought. It was a knotty problem, even for Praiseworthy. The next day, the French immigrant Monsieur Gaunt could be seen pacing the decks in one direction, while Mr. Azariah Jones paced it in the other. Mon Dieu, declared the Frenchman, I'm ruined. My grape cuttings are drying up, and the captain will not give me a drop of fresh water to keep them alive. I'm ruined. Then you must water them, said Praiseworthy. Water them? Exclaimed the Frenchman. Water them, you say? With what, monsieur? water, replied the butler. The Frenchman shook his head. I have 50 gold pieces in my money belt, but 1,000 gold pieces will not buy me a drop of fresh water on this ship. We must find a way, said Praiseworthy. Fresh water and coal lay waiting 1,000 miles further north at the port of Callao, on the coast of Peru. But the Lady Wilma seemed rooted to the spot, becalmed and motionless. All that day, Praiseworthy racked his brain. Fine men, Monsieur Gaunt and Mr. Azariah Jones, the butler told himself, and something must be done to help them. But even if a stiff wind came up, the gold ship could hardly make port soon enough to save the grape cuttings. And not even in Callao, Praiseworthy supposed, could he find a buyer for 18 barrels of spoiled potatoes. Indeed, Master Jack, said Praiseworthy, I seem to be a failure in my first attempt at both trade and agriculture. I suppose we should, at the very least, reimburse Mr. Azariah Jones for the first few raw potatoes we helped ourselves to as stowaways. Suddenly, Jack's eyebrows shot up. A thought bolted through him like lightning. He was unable to speak for a full 3 seconds. Praiseworthy, he exclaimed. That's it. That's what? You've got it! Got what? At that moment, Mr. Azariah Jones came pacing down the deck from one direction, while Monsieur Gaunt came pacing from the other. Jack quickly explained, and Praiseworthy's eyes instantly lit up. Gentlemen, said the butler, holding up his umbrella to stop the Yankee trader and the Frenchman. Master Jack here tells me I have hit upon a marvelous notion. Why, it's so simple, a boy could have thought of it. What's this? Asked Mr. Azariah Jones, his hands clasped hopelessly behind his back. Monsieur Gaunt, said Praiseworthy, as your agricultural advisor, I suggest that you buy Mr. Azariah Jones's 18 barrels of potatoes. They're a bit spoiled, but a good bargain. Potatoes? Exclaimed the Frenchman. Don't make jokes, monsieur. It's no joke, I assure you, said Praiseworthy. Confound it, Praiseworthy, grumbled the young Yankee trader. No one is going to pay me for my spoiled potatoes. Nonsense, said the butler. Spoiled the potatoes may be, but juicy they are, sir. Master Jack can attest to that. Why, they're like fat raindrops in brown skins. Monsieur Gaunt, you need only poke each of your grape cuttings into a plump potato. I dare say they will stay alive all the way to Callao. The Frenchman and the Yankee trader stood facing each other in the sun, and broad smiles crept over their slack, gloomy faces. The French, I'll buy your potatoes, exclaimed Monsieur Gaunt. I'll sell my potatoes, exclaimed Mr. Azariah Jones. I'm saved, said one. I'm saved, said the other. And the bargain was struck on the spot. Jack remained silent, but struck his hands in his pockets and felt proud of himself. Why, if he hadn't been a stowaway, if he hadn't slaked his thirst with the potatoes at hand, why, some future hillside would be left without a vineyard. I like that part. We see that, sort of like what we noticed with Praiseworthy, that Jack is being optimistic here, right? He's kind of finding a silver lining. You know, his family desperately needs money. His money was stolen by a thief, so he had to stow away on a ship to get to California. But if none of this had happened, if you know, he had just bought a regular ticket, he never would have been in the hold, never could have come up with this idea to help these two gentlemen. So he's kind of finding a silver lining here, and I like to see that side of Jack. Gentlemen, said Mr. Azariah Jones, beaming at Praiseworthy and Jack, you'll need a few tools in the gold fields. When we reach Callao, I'm going to buy you the best pick and shovel to be had. On the contrary, corrected the Frenchman, it is I who will buy them the best pick and shovel in Callao, in all of Peru. With that, Monsieur Gaunt hurried to the hold and busied himself with a jackknife. He cut holes in the potatoes and slipped in grape cuttings like so many straws. The next morning, a wind from the south came up and the Lady Wilma's canvas swelled out in great white billows. A happy shout went up and the ship began to move through the sea. For days after that, Mr. Azariah Jones stopped anyone who would listen to say, "Remarkable pair, Praiseworthy and the lad. Born traders, you know. Imagine finding a buyer for 18 barrels of spoiled potatoes." Snapping winds drove the gold ship into ever warmer latitudes. Soon the Argonauts were down to shirt sleeves again, and a growing excitement took hold of them, as if they could smell land in the air. Men began to trim their beards and wash their clothes. Callot stood 10 days ahead. In his stocking cap, Jack was taking on the aspect of a young sailor. The salt air and the wind had toughened his face. His eyes narrowed with a look of distance in them. He wandered higher and higher into the riggings, exploring the mysteries aloft, the foot ropes and shrouds and blocks. More than once, the boatswain, a bantam with a voice like a frog's, chased him down, but it was like trying to keep a boy out of a backyard tree. Hanging onto a yardarm, Jack was the first to notice a white speck on the horizon behind the Lady Wilma. The speck grew into sails, the sails into a ship, and the ship turned out to be the Sea Raven. "She's gaining on us!" shouted Mountain Jim. But by noon, the Sea Raven was alongside, skimming lightly over the seas. The wind seemed to pick her up and carry her along like a feather. "Blast!" roared Captain Swain. "And me half sunk in the water with building bricks. Bricks! I've a notion to dump them overboard." By dusk, the Sea Raven was gone, beyond the horizon, far ahead. All right. Chapter 7. End of the race. End of the race. So I guess we're going to find out in this chapter, would be my prediction based on this title, who wins, the Sea Raven or the Lady Wilma. Again, our picture doesn't really have to do with our chapter title. You'll see their animals here. They actually they look kind of weird, but my guess is that they're cats. So maybe there's going to be cats in this chapter. I love a good cat. Let's see what these cats have to do with our story. When the Lady Wilma entered the blue bay of Callot, Jack counted 31 sailing ships at anchor. He was disappointed that nowhere to be seen was the high-riding Sea Raven. "She's loaded up with a coal and fresh water," snapped Captain Swain. "Loaded up and skedaddled." Nevertheless, smiles were the order of the day. After months at sea, the gold seekers looked upon the sunny little town as if it were Paris or London. They couldn't wait to get ashore. Hardly had the mooring lines been thrown out like bullwhips when men began to leap to the wharf. "Master Jack, shall we go ashore?" said Praiseworthy. "I'd like that fine," smiled Jack. Jack posted another letter home to Boston. The streets thronged with sailors and gold seekers, and in the distance, the great Andes rose like painted scenery. The town wasn't a great deal larger than the ship they had just left at, the fueling wharf, but it was land, dry land. Jack had almost forgotten the smell of dust in his nostrils. He breathed it in like perfume. The butler and the boy rode about on mules, and the day had all the excitement of a picnic. Late in the afternoon, Mr. Azariah Jones hailed them in the sunny plaza. "Look here," he beamed. "I bought the last pick and shovel left in town. Since the California fever started, the shelves are bare, I can tell you, and a washpan thrown in for good measure. They're yours." "Voila," said Monsieur Gaunt, appearing out of the crowd and dropping a pick and shovel at their feet. "I have got my hands on the last ones in town, and a washpan too, my friends." Then he stopped to glare at the Yankee trader, who was already glaring at him. "Gentlemen," smiled Praiseworthy, "I think we can safely say that you have found the last 2 picks and shovels left in Callot. They're bound to bring us luck. Master Jack and I—" His words of gratitude were interrupted by the clanging of the Lady Wilma's bell, calling the gold seekers back to their ship. "Hurry, boys," shouted Mountain Jim. "The wild bull of the seas would be mighty glad to leave without us." There was a wild rush for the wharf, but when Jack turned, Praiseworthy was no longer standing beside him. Jack's hair very nearly stood on end. The butler was gone. Praiseworthy! The ship's bell rang through the air, but Jack didn't know which way to run. He couldn't leave Praiseworthy behind. Hadn't he heard the ship's warning bell? What had happened to him? Praiseworthy! Jack was unable to move, as if anchored to the spot by the pick and shovel. He had to fight back a welling up of tears. The Lady Wilma would leave without them. And then, from the doorway of a nearby shop, the butler appeared. Tall and elegant in his bowler hat and white gloves. He carried the new pick and shovel over one shoulder, the washpan under an arm, and a strange package wrapped in newspaper and string dangling freely from his hand. Jack had never been so happy to see anyone in his life. Hurry! He cried desperately. We'll get left behind! Not likely, said Praiseworthy. I had to stop off and make a small purchase for our good captain himself. Come along, Master Jack. Jack tried not to let Praiseworthy see that he had been close to tears. He threw the pick and shovel across one shoulder, gathered up the washpan, and together the boy and the butler hurried toward the wharf. One by one, alley cats picked up their trail. By the time they reached the ship, it looked as if every stray cat in Calais was after them. Before the gangway could be raised, at least a dozen assorted cats followed Praiseworthy aboard. In their stocking caps, the crew was too busy throwing off hawsers and preparing for sea to bother with the invasion of Peruvian cats. Jack dropped the heavy pick and shovel with a clang to deck and looked at Praiseworthy's package. A dead rat? He asked. Hardly, replied the butler. Cheese? Not likely. Fresh kidney? Exactly, said Praiseworthy, raising the package out of reach of the cats. Captain Swain is extraordinarily fond of kidney pie. I promised to teach the cook an old recipe by my great-great-grandfather used to prepare for the Duke of Chisley. But at the moment, Captain Swain was in no temper for kidney pie. The ship had taken on fresh water, but not an ounce of coal. Blast the Sea Raven, he was bellowing. She's filled her bunkers and piled her decks with coal. Hills of it, mountains of it, taken every lump to be had in Calais. She's made sure there wasn't a cinder left for us. Once at sea, the Lady Wilma picked up a friendly breeze. If her coal bunkers were empty, she was at least lighter in the water and went skimming along her course. The Peruvian cats learned to bound out of sight every time the husky-throated boatswain came along, threatening to toss them overboard. In an unguarded moment, a snap of the wind carried off Praiseworthy's bowler hat. It went tumbling into the sea, filled with water, and sank. Praiseworthy was left speechless and hatless. For 3 or 4 days, he was not quite himself. He missed the hat. He hardly felt like a butler without it, but Jack thought he looked just fine. A week later, as the heat bore down on deck, Praiseworthy began tying a handkerchief around his head. Jack liked that even better. You look like a pirate, he smiled. Nonsense, Master Jack, said Praiseworthy. Hoping for a supply of coal, Captain Swain dropped anchor in the Galapagos, but there was nothing to be had except a few cords of stove wood on those barren islands. And there was even less to see except the sharks in the bay. The Lady Wilma pushed on. With the rush for gold, steamers were only just being sent around the Horn to the Pacific, and fueling stops were rare. Weeks later, off the coast of Mexico, a sudden excitement raced along the decks of the gold ship. The Sea Raven had been sighted. She was lumbering through the sea, low in the water, weighed down by her extra tons of coal. They stood in enormous black piles on her weather decks. Billy be hanged, shouted Mountain Jim. We're going to pass her up. Jack stood on the ratlines and his heart raced with delight. The Sea Raven looked half sunk in the sea. Her passengers could be seen at the rails, glum and silent, as the Lady Wilma pulled ahead. By grabs, Captain Swain beamed, doing a little jig on the paddle box. I guess if there's anything heavier than a ton of bricks, it's a ton of coal. By the time the brown hills of California appeared off the port side, the Lady Wilma was well in the lead. Meanwhile, the Peruvian cats had Peruvian kittens. I'll drown 'em, everyone, swore the boatswain, but he had to catch them first. They ran for cover whenever he approached, disappearing within seconds. They found every hiding place aboard ship and invented new ones. Jack tried hard to ignore them, for good luck had taught him a lesson. But in the end, he was putting out galley scraps at night. Every morsel would be gone by morning. Dr. Buckbee spent his days fishing with the line tied around his peg leg. He would drowse in the sun until a tug roused him. But when his back was turned, the fish would disappear as if into thin air. The wily cats grew fatter. As San Francisco and the end of their long voyage drew nearer, the gold seekers began to trim their beards again. They packed and repacked their sea chests, they scrubbed their clothes, and they hummed, whistled, and sang the same tune. I'm going to California with my washbowl on my knee. Jack's thoughts raced ahead to the gold fields. What would it be like? Would there be grizzly bears and outlaws and wild Indians? Certainly, he told himself. It was an untamed place, wasn't it? What was the use of an untamed place if there weren't wild Indians and outlaws and grizzly bears? We ought to have a gun, he told Praiseworthy. A gun? Why? To protect ourselves. Stuff and nonsense, said the butler. But Jack noticed the other gold seekers busily cleaning sidearms and rifles and sharpening their knives. He wished he had a gun, a 4-shooter maybe, or even an old army musket with a bayonet. One bright morning, with San Francisco not more than a day's run, the bountiful winds died away. By afternoon, clouds had gathered in the sky, and headwinds bore down on the gold ship as if to drive her back in her wake. With steam in her boilers, the Sea Raven came steadily on course. By dusk, she had caught up to the Lady Wilma, passing with a wild shout of glee and a victorious blast of her whistle. Oh no, the other ship has caught up and is going in the lead because there's this heavy wind, right? This heavy wind that instead of pushing the ship forward, is actually pushing it back, and they don't have any coal to fight against that wind. So the Sea Raven, which has all the coal, has caught up. Boys, said Mountain Jim, it looks like we're done for. Not a bit, said Praiseworthy on his way to the pilot house. The Lady Wilma was already making a wide tack in the wind. She might be blown hundreds of miles off course, even as far away as the Sandwich Islands. That's what they used to call Hawaii, by the way, Sandwich Islands. The voyage isn't finished, sir. Not by a long shot. But even to Jack, with the wind snapping his shirt, it seemed that the Lady Wilma's luck had run out. Captain Swain would lose command of the new clipper ship building on the waves in Boston. Jack dug his hands in his pockets and glanced up to the pilot house. The wild bull of the seas didn't have a lump of coal to fight the headwinds. Jack was asleep in his hammock when he was aroused by a strange sound. At first he thought it must be Mr. Azariah Jones snoring in his sleep, or Mountain Jim, or Dr. Buckbee, but they came awake too. A deep throb ran through the ship, and then another. Then a splash of the side wheels could be heard. Then another, and another. The gold seekers bounded out of their bunks, some of them in nightcaps, and collected on deck. Sparks were flying from the funnel. Steam had been built up in the boilers. What's the captain burning? Said Mountain Jim, scratching his red whiskers. Cats? Hardly, said Praiseworthy, above the crash of the side wheels. He gave Jack a wink. Neither cats nor bricks nor spoiled potatoes. As any stowaway could tell you, gentlemen, we're carrying lumber in our cargo holds. Thousands of feet of it. Lumber enough to build a hotel. It occurred to Captain Swain to purchase what he needs with the ship's fuel account. Makes a fine shower of sparks, doesn't it? He says, it occurred to Captain Swain. But I think this is like when Praiseworthy said that Master Jack had an idea, but really it was Praiseworthy who had an idea. That happened twice, right? Or the time that Master Jack said Praiseworthy had an idea, but really Master Jack had it. I think this idea was really Praiseworthy's. But the race was not yet won, and Jack could sleep no more that night. He pulled on an old pea jacket the frog-voiced boatswain had handed down to him, and stood with Praiseworthy at the rail. This would be their last night aboard ship, after all. The paddle wheels twirled faster and faster, and the bowsprit came around on course like a compass needle. It was you, wasn't it? Jack grinned. Me, Master Jack. You told the captain about the lumber. Oh, he knew it was there, but with all his storming about the bricks in the hold, he hadn't stopped to give the lumber a thought. I merely reminded him, you might say. In the dark of morning, the Lady Wilma had managed to gain on the Sea Raven. The gold ships thrashed bowsprit to bowsprit, and the red glow of their smokestacks lit up the surrounding sea. More lumber! Shouted Captain Swain into his voice tube. I want every ounce of steam the boiler'll hold, and then some. The Sea Raven, too, was making a final sprint. By noon, the Golden Gate stood ahead of them. But the extra burden of her mountains of deck coal was too much for the Sea Raven. Beat by beat of her side wheels, the Lady Wilma pulled slowly ahead. Wood sparks showered from her funnel. She entered the sparkling narrows of the Golden Gate and finally came out into San Francisco Bay. The city stretched out across the sand dunes like something that had sprung up the night before. There seemed to be more ships in the harbor than houses on the shore. Let go the anchor! Captain Swain shouted from the pilot house window. A moment later, the anchor chain went rattling into the bay, and hats went flying in the air. Beaver hats and straw hats, and even a cat or two. Praiseworthy and Jack gathered up their picks and shovels, washpans and carpet bags, and peered at the golden hills of San Francisco. The houses looked like packing boxes with roofs, and tents of every description were pitched along the dunes. Gentlemen, said Praiseworthy, tugging on his white gloves, I believe we've won the race. After a 15,000-mile voyage and 5 months at sea, the gold seekers had arrived. And that's where we will end for today. We will pick up next time with Chapter 8 called Saved by a Whisker. I hope you enjoyed the reading today, and I will see you next time.